Fifth, I was not aware that Ambassador Sondland spoke with President Trump on July 26th, while Ambassador Taylor and I were visiting the conflict zone. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, allow me to thank you again for the opportunity to provide this testimony. I believe that U.S. foreign policy and national security interests in Ukraine are of critical importance, and I would be pleased to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your opening statements. We'll now proceed to the first round of questions. As detailed in the memo provided to committee members, there will be 45 minutes of questions conducted by the chairman or majority counsel, followed by 45 minutes for the ranking member or minority counsel. Following that, unless I specify additional equal time for extended questioning, we'll proceed under the 5-minute rule, and every member will have a chance to ask questions. I now recognize myself or counsel for the first round of questions. Ambassador Volker, I was going to just yield to the minority counsel, but there are a couple points that you made in your opening statement that I wanted to ask about first. First, you said that now former Attorney General Lutsenko was not credible. Mr. Lutsenko is the author of a number of allegations against Ambassador Yovanovitch, a number of allegations that were shared with John Sullivan of the Hill, a number of allegations that have been repeatedly brought up by my Republican colleagues. Why is it that you found Mr. Lutsenko not credible and told Mr. Giuliani so?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, the allegations themselves, including those against Ambassador Yovanovitch, did not appear to me to be credible at all. I know her to be an incredibly competent professional, someone I've worked with for many, many years. The suggestions that she was acting in some inappropriate manner were not credible to me. I've known Vice President Biden for a long time. Those accusations were not credible. And then separate from that, I also was aware of the political situation in Ukraine. We had a situation where President Poroshenko appeared to not be in a favorable position going into the elections, where it was increasingly apparent then candidate Zelensky was going to win. As is often the case in Ukraine, a change in power would mean change in prosecutorial powers as well. And there have been efforts in the past at prosecuting the previous government. I think Mr. Lutsenko, in my estimation, and I said this to Mayor Giuliani when I met with him, was interested in preserving his own position. He wanted to avoid being fired by a new government in order to prevent prosecution of himself, possible prosecution of himself. Possibly also this is something that President Poroshenko would have welcomed as well, because he probably would have avoided any efforts to prosecute President Poroshenko as well. So by making allegations like this and making sure they were reaching U.S. media, I think that Mr. Lutsenko was trying to make himself appear to be an important and influential player in the United States.
Ambassador, let me also ask you about the allegations against Joe Biden, because that has been a continuing refrain from some of my colleagues as well. Why was it that you found the allegations against Joe Biden related to his son or Burisma not to be believed?
Simply because I've known former Vice President Biden for a long time. I know how he respects his duties of higher office, and it's just not credible to me that a Vice President of the United States is going to do anything other than act as how he sees best for the national interest.
And finally, Ambassador, before I turn it over, I was struck by something you said on page 8 of your statement, which reads, "In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them as different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect," you said, "I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections." What is it now, Ambassador, in retrospect, that you recognize that you didn't at this time that leads you to conclude that you would or should have raised these objections?
Yeah. That others did not see the distinction between these things as I saw it. As I said, there is a history of corruption in Ukraine. There's a history with the company of Burisma that's been investigated. That is well known. There is a separate allegation about the vice president acting inappropriately. His son was a board member of this company, but those things I saw as completely distinct. And what I was trying to do in working with the Ukrainians was to thread a needle to see whether things that they can do that are appropriate and reasonable as part of Ukraine's own policy of fighting corruption that help clarify for our president that they are committed to that very effort. If there's a way to thread that needle, I thought it was worth the effort to try to solve that problem. As it turns out, I now understand that most of the other people didn't see or didn't consider this distinction, that for them it was synonymous.
Well, one of those people who saw it synonymous turns out to be the President of the United States. I take it you didn't know until the call record was released that the President in that call doesn't raise Burisma. He asked for an investigation of the Bidens. Is that right?
That is correct.
I take it, since you say that you acknowledge that asking for an investigation of the Bidens would have been unacceptable and objectionable, that had the President asked you to get Ukraine to investigate the Bidens, you would have told him so?
I would have objected to that, yes, sir.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one follow-up on that, Ambassador Volker. When you say thread the needle, you mean that you understood the relationship between Vice President Biden's son and Burisma, but you were trying to separate the two of them in your mind? Is that right?
Well, I believe that they were separate. This references the conversation I had with Mr. Giuliani as well, where I think the allegations against Vice President Biden are self-serving and not credible. Separate question is whether it is appropriate for Ukraine to investigate possible corruption of Ukrainians that may have tried to corrupt things or buy influence. To me, they are very different things. And as I said, I think the former is unacceptable. I think the latter, in this case, is...
Understood. But you understood the relationship between Hunter Biden and Burisma.
I knew that he had been a board member of the company, yes.
Let's go back...
That's why it was so important to maintain a distinction.
Let's focus on the July 25th call for a moment. And Mr. Morrison, July 25th was day number what for you as the senior director overseeing Ukraine?
I officially took over on the 15th, approximately 10 days, very few days actually in the office.
You testified in your deposition that you received an email on the morning of July 25th from Ambassador Sondland shortly before the call. Is that right?
Yes.
And I believe in that email, Ambassador Sondland told you that he had briefed President Trump about in advance of the call. Is that right?
Yes.
And you also testified that Ambassador Sondland had told you on another occasion that he could call the president whenever he wanted. Is that right?
Yes.
And on July 25th, did you in fact make an effort to confirm whether or not the phone call between Ambassador Sondland and President Trump actually occurred?
I did.
And did it happen?
Yes.
On other occasions, when Ambassador Sondland told you that he spoke with President Trump, on some other occasions, did you also seek confirmation of that fact?
On some, yes.
And on those occasions when you did seek to confirm that they had spoken, what did you find?
They had.
Now, I'm going to pull up a text message on the morning of July 25th between, well, it should be another one. Ambassador Sondland with you, Ambassador Volker. And at 7:54 in the morning, Ambassador Sondland says, call ASAP. Then at 9:35, Ambassador Volker, you respond. Is the screen working in front of you or just to the side? Yeah. So if you could go ahead and read what you said.
Yes.
At 9:35.
Yes. So I say, hi, Gordon, got your message. Had a great lunch with Yermak and then passed your message to him. He will see you tomorrow. Think everything is in place.
And who is Yermak?
Andriy Yermak is the senior advisor to President Zelensky of Ukraine.
Now, what was the message that you had received?
That President Zelensky should be clear, convincing, forthright with President Trump about his commitment to fighting corruption, investigating what happened in the past, get to the bottom of things, whatever there is. And if he does that, President Trump was prepared to be reassured that he would say, yes, come on, let's get this date for this visit scheduled.
And did you understand from that message that Ambassador Sondland had spoken to President Trump?
I wasn't sure whether he had or not. He, as Mr. Morrison just said that he does speak with President Trump. I knew that he had conversations in general. I didn't know specifically about one leading up to this.
Now, on the screen in front of you is another text message from you that same morning.
Yes.
At 8:36 in the morning to Andrei Yermak.
Yes, I believe because of the time difference, this is actually in the afternoon in Ukraine.
In Ukraine. And so this is East Coast time. That's right. So this is slightly less than a half hour before the call between President Trump and President Zelensky.
Right.
And can you just read what you wrote there?
Yes, and just after the lunch that I had with Andrei Yermak. It says, good lunch, thanks. Heard from the White House. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for a visit to Washington. Good luck. See you tomorrow, Kurt.
And does this accurately relay the message that you had received from Ambassador Sondland?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Morrison, did the National Security Council also prepare talking points for President Trump for this call?
The NSC staff did, yes.
And per usual custom, were these talking points based on the official United States policy objectives?
They were.
And since there's been a little bit of dispute about what that means, can you explain how official U.S. policy is determined through the interagency process?
We operate under what's known as NSPM4, National Security Presidential Memorandum 4. It's available on the internet. That lays out how the president wants to be provided options for his decision.
And there's an extensive process to finalize any policy, is that right?
Sometimes.
Did you, Mr. Morrison, you listened to this call on the 25th, is that right?
I did.
Where did you listen from?
The White House Situation Room.
In your deposition, you testified that the call was not what you were hoping to hear. What did you mean by that?
I was hoping for a more full-throated statement of support from the president concerning President Zelensky's reform agenda, given where we were at the time with respect to the overwhelming mandate President Zelensky's servant of the party people had received in the Rada election.
And that Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, that election had occurred 4 days earlier?
Sounds right.
And President Zelensky's party won in a landslide, is that right?
They received more than a majority in their own right.
So at least in Ukraine, there was tremendous support for Zelensky's anti-corruption agenda, is that right?
At the time.
And within the interagency, within the national security agencies here in the United States, was there broad support for President Zelensky?
There was broad support for giving President Zelensky a chance.
And to that point, he had shown that he had at least put his money where his mouth was for the 3 months that he had been in office. Is that right?
Approximately 3 months, yes.
Now, I want to show a couple of excerpts from this call record to each of you. The first is President Trump responding to a comment by President Zelensky related to defense support from the United States and the purchase of javelins. And President Trump then says, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot, and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people, the server. They say Ukraine has it. And if we could go to the next excerpt, where President Trump says, the other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me. Now, Mr. Morrison, were these references to CrowdStrike, the server, in 2016 election, and to Vice President Biden and his son, were they included in the president's talking points?
They were not.
And were they consistent with what you understood at that time to be official U.S. policy?
I was not aware of much of this at the time.
And in fact, subsequent to this call, you did nothing to implement the investigations that President Trump, implement the request for the investigations that President Trump asked for. Is that right?
I did not understand any instruction to do so.
And you were not aware of anyone else within you coordinate the interagency process, and you were not aware of anyone else who was doing that either. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, you testified in your deposition that hearing this call confirmed what you called the parallel process that your predecessor, Fiona Hill, had warned you about. What did you mean by that?
During the period in which Dr. Hill and I were conducting handoff meetings so that I could be up to speed on the various things that were occurring in the portfolio at the time, she mentioned the traditional NSPM4 process and the parallel process. And in the context of discussing the parallel process, she mentioned issues like Burisma, which were noteworthy to me at the time because I had never heard of them before. And upon hearing them in the call, it wound up confirming, okay, there's something here.
And who did she inform you was involved in this parallel process?
As I recall, it was definitely Ambassador Sondland and I believe Mr. Giuliani.
And after she informed you of this company, Burisma, what, if anything, did you do to determine what that was?
After that particular handoff meeting, I proceeded to look it up on the internet. I Googled it.
And did you find that it had some association with Hunter Biden?
Yes.
Now, Ambassador Volker, you did not listen to this call, but you testified that you were surprised and troubled when you read the call record after it was released on September 25th. And you also said that after reading the call record, it was clear to you that the Biden, Burisma, and the 2016 election investigations that President Trump discussed on the call were designed to serve the president's political interests, not the national interests. What did you mean when you said that?
So I don't recall that language from my testimony. It's from my October 3rd testimony?
Yes, it was.
Thank you. Well, what I do mean by that, and I'd like to phrase it in my own words now, is I don't think that raising 2016 elections or Vice President Biden or these things I consider to be conspiracy theories that have been circulated by the Ukrainians, particularly the former prosecutor general, are sort of, they're not things that we should be pursuing as part of our national security strategy with Ukraine. We should be supporting Ukraine's democracy, reforms, its own fight against corruption domestically, its struggle against Russia, its defense capabilities. These are the heart of what we should be doing, and I don't think pursuing these things serves a national interest.
Now, Mr. Morrison, shortly after you heard the July 25th call, you testified that you alerted the NSC legal advisor, John Eisenberg, pretty much right away. Is that right?
Correct.
And you indicated in your opening statement, or at least from your deposition, that you went to Mr. Eisenberg out of concern over the potential political fallout if the call record became public, and not because you thought it was illegal. Is that right?
Correct.
But you would agree, right, that asking a foreign government to investigate a domestic political rival is inappropriate, would you not?
It's not what we recommended the president discuss.
Now, in a second meeting with Mr. Eisenberg, what did you recommend that he do to prevent the call record from leaking?
I recommended we restrict access to the package.
Had you ever asked the NSC legal advisor to restrict access before?
No.
Did you speak to your supervisor, Dr. Kupperman, before you went to speak to John Eisenberg?
No.
Did you subsequently learn that the call record had been put in a highly classified system?
I did.
And what reason did Mr. Eisenberg give you for why the call record was put in the highly classified system?
It was a mistake.
He said it was just a mistake?
It was an administrative error.
Now, isn't it also true, though, that you had authority to restrict access on the regular system if you wanted to?
I believe I could have instructed the appropriate staff to do so, yes.
So why did you go to the NSC legal advisor to recommend that?
Well, I was also concerned that based on the participants in the listening room that day, I did not then, and I do not now, recall any representatives from the NSC legal advisor's office, as they were often on head of state calls, but not always, and I wanted to make sure that John Eisenberg, as the legal advisor, and his deputy were aware to review this particular transcript.
And you wanted them to review it because you were concerned about the potential political consequences, not because of anything was wrong?
Correct. And political consequences was an umbrella term I used in my statement to describe a series of effects I feared about what would happen if and when the content of the transcript or the content of the MEMCON leaked.
So just to make sure I understand this correctly, Mr. Morrison, you heard the call. You recognized that President Trump was not discussing the talking points that the NSC had prepared based on official U.S. policy, and was instead talking about the investigations that Fiona Hill had warned you about, and then you reported it immediately to the NSC legal advisor. Is that the correct chain of events here?
That's correct.
Now, Ambassador Volker, in the July 25th call, President Zelensky volunteers to President Trump that Rudy Giuliani had already spoken with one of his associates and that President Zelensky hopes Giuliani will come to Ukraine. Then in response, President Trump proceeds to mention Mr. Giuliani on 3 separate occasions during this call. You testified about a May 23rd meeting in the Oval Office where the President spoke quite negatively about Ukraine and how it would try to take him down, and that he also repeated some of the allegations that Mr. Giuliani was making. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and those allegations were in the media, were they not?
Yes.
And during that meeting, President Trump told you and Ambassador Sondland and Secretary Perry to talk to Giuliani. Isn't that correct?
I didn't take it as an instruction. I want to be clear about that. He said, that's not what I hear. You know, when we were giving him our assessment about President Zelensky and where Ukraine is headed, he said, that's not what I hear. I hear terrible things. He's got terrible people around him. Talk to Rudy. And I understood in that context him just saying that's where he hears it from. I didn't take it as an instruction.
So when he said talk to Rudy, you didn't take it for him to mean for you to talk to Rudy?
No, I didn't take it that way. I took it as that just part of the dialogue, that I hear other things. I hear them from Rudy Giuliani, I hear them from other people. That's not what's going on. He's surrounded by terrible people. Talk to Rudy. You know, it just seemed like part of the dialogue.
Well, after that meeting, did you in fact talk to Rudy?
After that meeting, not immediately, no. Remember, this was May 23rd, and we continued to proceed with our effort to get the White House visit for President Zelensky scheduled and to keep ramping up our support for the new Ukrainian president and ultimately the new Ukrainian government. I did, however, on July 2nd, as I was becoming concerned that we were not succeeding at this, tell President Zelensky, I think we have a problem, and that problem being this negative feed of information from Mr. Giuliani.
And ultimately, I think as you testified in your opening statement, you introduced Mr. Yermak to Mr. Giuliani, and they eventually met. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, during this whole time in July and after the call into early August when they met, Ukraine still desperately wanted that Oval Office meeting for President Zelensky, correct?
That is correct.
And you also wanted that for President Zelensky, is that right?
That is correct.
Why was that Oval Office meeting so important to President Zelensky?
I think that he felt that he was not well understood by President Trump. He is a charismatic leader who ran a remarkable campaign in Ukraine against the legacy of corruption and political malaise that had been there. He had a massive showing in the presidential election, 73% support. He believed he was leading a movement of major change in Ukraine, and that President Trump did not see that or didn't appreciate that. But if he had a chance to sit down and speak with President Trump face to face, he believed that he could be very convincing about that, and I agree with him.
That certainly was your assessment, right?
It was my assessment, and I believe it was also what President Zelensky believed.
And certainly that you understood from your experience in Ukraine that there would be a significant boost in legitimacy at home for President Zelensky if there were photos of him in the Oval Office, et cetera, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, you testified in your opening statement that Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Yermak, Zelensky's aide, met on August 2nd. Where did they meet?
They met in Madrid.
And did you learn that Mr. Giuliani requested anything of the Ukrainians at that meeting?
Only when I spoke with Mr. Giuliani afterwards, he said that he thought Ukraine should issue a statement. And then I spoke with Mr. Yermak after that, and he said yes, and we were prepared to make a statement. And that then kicked off the series of discussions that I said in my testimony.
We'll get into that in a second, but Mr. Giuliani did not explain to you what needed to be included in that statement, in that call you had?
He said something more general, as I recall. I recall him saying fight corruption, that their commitment to being different. Mr. Yermak told me when I spoke with him, as I recall, that the statement would include specific mention of Burisma and 2016.
Right. Let's go through some of the text messages so we know exactly who said what. And first, let's start on August 9th. This is a text exchange between you and Ambassador Sondland, where Ambassador Sondland writes at the top, Morrison ready to get dates as soon as Yermak confirms. And what did you respond?
I said, excellent, with 2 exclamation points. How did you sway him with a smile afterwards?
Ambassador Sondland responded, not sure I did. I think POTUS really wants the deliverable. And what did you say to that?
But how does he know that?
And Ambassador Sondland says, yep, clearly lots of convos going on. Now, Mr. Morrison, you're referenced in this text message. Had you discussed confirming a date for a White House visit for President Zelensky with Ambassador Sondland around this time?
I likely would have.
And did you have any discussions with him about a statement that Ukraine they were trying to get Ukraine to make?
I did not.
Were you aware that? Do you yourself know what Ambassador Sondland meant by the deliverable?
I did not at the time. I think I have an understanding now.
And what is your understanding now?
There seems to have been discussions about a statement, various drafts of which have been discussed in various proceedings.
Okay. But this, to your knowledge, was part of that parallel process you were talking about?
Yes.
If we can now go to the next exhibit, which is another text exchange just a few minutes later between Ambassador Sondland and you, Ambassador Volker, where Ambassador Sondland says, to avoid misunderstandings, might be helpful to ask Andre for a draft statement, embargoed, so that we can see exactly what they propose to cover. Even though Zelensky, does a live presser, they can still summarize in a brief statement. Thoughts? And how did you respond?
Agree.
And this relates to the statement that Mr. Giuliani wanted, is that right, Ambassador Volker?
It relates to the statement that he and Mr. Yermak had discussed.
Right. And now to the next day, on August 10th, there's another text exchange between you and Mr. Yermak, who's the same aide that Mr. Giuliani had met in Madrid. And if you could read what you wrote at the top at 5:02 p.m.
Right. I wrote, I agree with your approach. Let's iron out statement and use that to get date, and then President Zelensky can go forward with it.
And Mr. Yermak responds, once we have a date, we will call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling in investigations. And what did you respond?
Sounds great.
Now, the date that he's referring to, that is the date for the White House visit?
That's correct.
Now, 2 days later, on August 12th, you receive another text message from Mr. Yermak, which reads, "Special attention should be paid to the problem of interference in the political processes of the United States, especially with the alleged involvement of some Ukrainian politicians. I want to declare that this is unacceptable. We intend to initiate and complete a transparent and unbiased investigation of all available facts and episodes, which in turn will prevent the recurrence of this problem in the future." Now, Ambassador Volker, this was a draft, was it not, of the statement that you and Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Yermak and Ambassador Sondland had been discussing?
This is the first draft of that from Mr. Yermak after the conversations that we had.
And it does not mention Burisma or the 2016 election interference, correct?
It does not.
And you testified in your deposition that you and Ambassador Sondland and Mayor Giuliani had a conversation about this draft after you received it. Is that right?
That is correct.
And Mr. Giuliani said that if the statement did not include Burisma and 2016 election, it would not have any credibility. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, this was the same Rudy Giuliani that President Trump was discussing in that May 23rd meeting and asked you and the others to talk to, correct?
That is the same Mr. Giuliani.
And even at that point, on May 23rd, you were aware of these investigations that he was publicly promoting, correct?
I knew that he had adopted or was interested in all of those conspiracy theories that had come from Lutsenko.
Back in May, you knew that?
Back in May.
Yeah. Now, he was insisting on a public commitment from President Zelensky to do these investigations, correct?
Well, now, what do we mean by these investigations?
Burisma and the 2016 election.
Burisma in 2016, yes.
Yeah. And at the time that you were engaged in coordinating for this statement, did you find it unusual that there was such an emphasis on a public statement from President Zelensky to carry out the investigations that the president was seeking?
I didn't find it that unusual. I think when you're dealing with a situation where I believe the president was highly skeptical about President Zelensky being committed to really changing Ukraine after his entirely negative view of the country, that he would want to hear something more from President Zelensky to be convinced that, okay, I'll give this guy a chance.
And perhaps he also wanted a public statement because it would lock Mr. President Zelensky in to do these investigations that he thought might benefit him?
Well, again, when we say these investigations, what I understood us to be talking about was Ukrainian corruption.
Well, what we're talking about is Burisma and the 2016 election. Let's just, we can agree on that. And so when we're talking about these investigations, isn't it clear that a public statement would be important to Mr. Giuliani because it was politically useful to the president?
The way I saw it is that it would be helpful.
Right.
It would be a way of being convincing to Mayor Giuliani and also the president that this team in Ukraine is serious about fighting corruption reform, that they are different. And if that would be helpful in getting a more positive attitude and the White House meeting scheduled, then that would be useful.
And that would be helpful to get that White House meeting.
Correct.
In fact, it was a necessary condition, as you understood at that point, right?
I wouldn't have called it a necessary condition. And in fact, when it became clear later that we were not able to agree on an agreement that the Ukrainians were comfortable with, I agree with the Ukrainians just to drop it. It's not worth it.
No, I understand that, but is it your testimony that based on the text that you wrote linking the investigations and the 2016 election on July 25th to the White House meeting, you're saying that by this point in August, with this back and forth, that you were unaware that this public statement was a condition for the White House meeting?
I wouldn't have called it a condition. It's a nuance, I guess, but I viewed it as very helpful. If we could get this done, it would help improve the perception that President Trump and others had, and then we would get the date for a meeting. If we didn't have a statement, I wasn't giving up and thinking that, oh, well, then we'll never get a meeting.
Let's go to the next day, where there was another text exchange. And at the top, could you just read the first text there?
It says, "Hi, Andre. Good talking. Following is text with insert at the end for the 2 key items. we will work on official request.
And then you'll see the highlighted portion of the next text. The other is identical to your previous one, and then it just
And
adds
it
including
includes that. Correct.
including these involving Burisma in the 2016 elections. Is that right?
That is correct.
And that was what Mr. Giuliani insisted on adding to the statement?
That's what he said would be necessary for that to be credible.
And the Ukrainians ultimately did not issue this statement, is that right?
That is correct.
And President Zelensky ultimately did not get the Oval Office meeting either, did he?
Not yet.
Now, I want to move forward to September, in early September, when the security assistance begins to more overtly be used as leverage to pressure the Ukrainians to conduct these investigations that President Trump wanted. Mr. Morrison, you accompanied Vice President Pence to Warsaw when he met with President Zelensky, is that right?
I was in Warsaw when the vice president was designated as the president's representative. I was accompanying Ambassador Bolton.
Understood. But you were at the bilateral meeting with the vice president and President Zelensky, correct?
I was.
And in that meeting, were the Ukrainians concerned about the hold on security clearance, military assistance rather? But
Yes.
what did they say?
It was the first issue that President Zelensky raised with Vice President Pence. They were very interested. They talked about its importance to Ukraine, its importance to the relationship.
And what was Vice President Pence's response?
The Vice President represented that it was a priority for him and that we were working to address, and he characterized President Trump's concerns about the state of corruption in Ukraine and the President's prioritization of getting the Europeans to contribute more to security sector assistance.
And did he directly explain to the Ukrainians that those were the actual reasons for the hold, or was he just commenting on general concerns of the President?
I don't know that he necessarily acknowledged a hold. He mentioned that we were reviewing the assistance. I mean, that's the way I heard it. That's the way I would characterize it. And those were the points he raised to help President Zelensky understand where we were in our process.
And to your knowledge, though, on sort of the staff level, as the coordinator of all the interagency process, you were not aware of any review of the Ukraine security assistance money, were you?
Well, we had been running a review. We had been running an interagency process to provide the President the information that I had been directed to generate for the President's consideration as to the state of interagency support for continuing Ukraine security sector assistance.
And the entire interagency supported the continuation of the security assistance, isn't that right?
That is correct.
Now, after this larger meeting with Vice President Pence and President Zelensky, you testified at your deposition that you saw Ambassador Sondland immediately go over and pull Andrei Yermak aside and have a conversation. Is that right?
I mean, it was President Zelensky left the room, Vice President Pence left the room, and in sort of an ante-room, Ambassador Sondland and Presidential Advisor Yermak had this discussion, yes.
And what did Ambassador Sondland say to tell you that he told Mr. Yermak?
That the Ukrainians would have to have the Prosecutor General make a statement with respect to the investigations as a condition of having the aid lifted.
And you testified that you were not comfortable with what Ambassador Sondland had told you. Why not?
Well, I was concerned about what I saw as essentially an additional hurdle to accomplishing what I had been directed to help accomplish, which was giving the President the information he needed to determine that the security sector assistance could go forward.
So now there's a whole other wrinkle to it, right?
There was the appearance of one based on what Ambassador Sondland represented.
And you told Ambassador Taylor about this conversation as well, is that right?
I promptly reached out to Ambassador Taylor to schedule a secure phone call.
And in your deposition, you testified that his testimony, other than one small distinction between President Zelensky and the Prosecutor General, was accurate as to what you told him. Is that correct?
About that conversation, yes.
And generally speaking, you confirmed everything that Ambassador Taylor told you, except for that one thing and a small other ministerial matter relating to the location of a meeting. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, did you tell Ambassador Bolton about this conversation as well?
I reached out to him as well and requested his availability for a secure phone call.
And what was his response when you explained to him what Ambassador Sondland had said?
Tell the lawyers.
Did you go tell the lawyers?
When I returned to the States, yes.
And did he explain to you why he wanted you to tell the lawyers?
He did not.
Now, a few days later, on September 7th, you spoke again to Ambassador Sondland, who told you that he had just gotten off the phone with President Trump. Isn't that right?
That sounds correct, yes.
What did Ambassador Sondland tell you that President Trump said to him?
If I recall this conversation correctly, this was where Ambassador Sondland related that there was no quid pro quo, but President Zelensky had to make the statement and that he had to want to do it.
And by that point, did you understand that the statement related to the Biden and 2016 investigations?
I think I did, yes.
And that was essentially a condition for the security assistance to be released?
I understood that that's what Ambassador Sondland believed.
After speaking with President Trump?
That's what he represented.
Now, you testified that hearing this information gave you a sinking feeling. Why was that?
Well, I believe if we're on September 7th, the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, these are one-year dollars, the DOD and the Department of State funds. So we only had so much time, and in fact, because Congress imposed a 15-day notification requirement on the State Department funds, September 7th, September 30th, that really means September 15th, in order to secure a decision from the President to allow the funds to go forward.
Did you tell Ambassador Bolton about this conversation as well?
I did, yes.
And what did he say to you?
He said to tell the lawyers.
And why did he say to tell the lawyers?
He did not explain his direction.
But he doesn't tell you to go tell the lawyers because you're running up on the 8-day deadline there, right?
Again, I don't know why he directed that, but it seemed reasonable and was consistent with what I was going to do anyway.
Right. And you weren't going to go tell them because of that concern, right? You were concerned about what you were hearing Ambassador Sondland relay to you, correct? So just so we're clear, you reported 2 concerning conversations that you had with Ambassador Sondland to the lawyers in early September, in which you understood from him that the President was withholding security assistance as additional leverage to get Ukraine to publicly announce the specific political investigations that President Trump had discussed on the July 25th call. Is that accurate?
I was concerned about what Ambassador Sondland was saying were requirements, yes.
Right. And you understood, though, that the investigations that Ambassador Sondland was referring to were the 2 that President Trump referenced on the July 25th call, correct?
At this point, yes.
And during this early September time period, Mr. Morrison, did you have any conversations with Ambassador Volker about any of this?
I believe we had one conversation.
And what do you recall about that conversation?
I believe on or about September 6th, Ambassador Volker was in town to provide an update on some of his activities, and he provided that update, and then we had a one-on-one conversation about this track, this separate process.
And what do you recall saying to him about the separate process?
I think I was interested in understanding his understanding of events.
Did you explain to him what your understanding of events was?
I think I was primarily on receive mode.
Okay. And Ambassador Volker, do you recall this conversation?
Thank you. I do remember a conversation with Tim. I'm not sure about the timing. I left around that time to go on a trip, and so it may have been a little bit earlier. I'm not sure about the timing. And what I do remember the discussion being is Tim asking me, what is my impression of the role that Ambassador Sondland plays? And my response to that was, well, I find it helpful that he has political contacts in the White House. I don't have those contacts. I'm working the national security, the diplomatic front, but I don't have the political contacts. And so if he's able to use those to support the same goals that we are working toward, then I view that as helpful.
Well, that's a good segue to our next exhibit, which is a September 8th text exchange with you and Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Sondland. And at the top, Ambassador Sondland says, guys, multiple convos with Z, that's Zelensky, period, POTUS, period, let's talk. And then Ambassador Taylor, about 16 minutes later, says, Gordon and I just spoke. I can brief you, meaning you, Ambassador Volker, if you and Gordon don't connect. Approximately 1 hour later, Ambassador Taylor says, the nightmare is they give the interview and don't get the security assistance. The Russians love it, and I quit. And then at the bottom, about 5 hours later, how do you respond?
Say, I'm not in the loop. Talk Monday?
So you were not in the loop in terms of all of these conversations that Ambassador Taylor, Mr. Morrison, Ambassador Sondland were having?
Yes, that's correct.
And now ultimately the hold was lifted on September 11th. Is that right, Ambassador Volker?
That's my understanding.
Okay. And Mr. Morrison, were you aware that prior to September 11th that the White House, that there was a whistleblower complaint circulating around the White House?
I don't believe so, no.
But you were aware of a request to preserve records, were you not?
We received a number of those requests. I have a general recollection of one as it related to Ukraine.
And one final question. When was the hold lifted?
As I understand it, the President gave that direction the evening of September 11th.
Which was 2 days after Congress announced an investigation. Were you aware of that?
I believe I was familiar with the letter from the 3 committee chairmen.
I yield.
That concludes the majority 45 minutes. Before I turn to the minority, are you both and your counsel okay, or do you need a break? Okay. Ranking Member Nunes, you're recognized for 45 minutes.
Well, Ambassador and Mr. Morrison, I have some bad news for you. TV ratings are way down. Way down. Don't hold it personally. I don't think it's you guys. But whatever drug deal the Democrats are cooking up here on the dais, American people aren't buying it. I know you've both answered this in your opening statements, but I just want to bring a little more clarity to it. Mr. Morrison, I'll start with you. Did anyone ever ask you to bribe or extort anyone at any time during your time in the White House?
No, sir.
And you were the top person for Ukraine in the White House, correct? At the NSC level.
I would argue Ambassador Bolton would be, but...
Reporting to Ambassador Bolton.
I was a senior official, yes, sir.
Ambassador Volker, you have a storied career. We're very thankful for your service, and you were the special envoy to Ukraine.
That is correct.
Did anyone at the White House ever ask you to bribe or extort anything out of anyone at any time?
No, sir.
Thank you. I want to thank you both for being here, and I'll yield to Mr. Castor.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. Thank you both for being here today and also for participating in the lengthy depositions. Ambassador Volker, you were the first one on October 3rd, and Mr. Morrison, you were with us on Halloween. So thank you for your participation. Mr. Morrison, also want to thank you. You're a longtime Hill staffer. I certainly have appreciation for that. Nearly 20 years. So thank you. And Ambassador Volker, Hatboro, Pennsylvania resident.
Absolutely.
It's an incredible part of the country.
Very proud of it.
Yeah, I'm from nearby. Just want to walk through some of your positions. You were Senate confirmed ambassador to NATO for a stint.
That is correct.
And then you were at the State Department, and your portfolio spanned much of what I believe George Kent has currently.
I was the principal deputy assistant secretary, so I had all of, working for the assistant secretary, I had all of Europe and Eurasia, and particular responsibility for NATO, Western Europe, and the European Union.
And then you were involved with the National Security Council. You were the director for NATO and Western Europe.
That is correct.
And then you were the senior director for European and Eurasian affairs.
I was acting for several months, 6 months or so.
Okay, and much like the job that Mr. Morrison had. And we'll note that all the witnesses that we have interacted with have just heaped praise on you. Ambassador Yovanovitch said you were a brilliant diplomat, so that's very high praise. And for over 2 years, you served as the special representative for Ukraine negotiations?
That is correct.
And you served for free?
That is correct.
You served on a voluntary basis?
I did.
And you put a lot of time and effort into that job, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
The taxpayers certainly got their money's worth, didn't they?
Not for me to say.
You believe America's policy towards Ukraine has been strengthened during your tenure as the special representative?
Absolutely. When I look back at the record, I think we did an awful lot to support Ukraine.
And is it fair to say that's in part due to President Trump?
President Trump approved each of the decisions made along the way, providing lethal defensive equipment and the non-recognition statement on Crimea, I think, being two of the most important ones.
And for many years, there had been an initiative in the interagency to advocate for lethal defensive weaponry for Ukraine. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And it wasn't until President Trump and his administration came in that went through?
That is correct.
The delegation to President Zelensky's inauguration in May, I believe you testified it was one of the largest delegations?
I believe it was, I can't be 100% sure, but I believe it was the largest national delegation.
Okay, and included in the delegation was Secretary Perry.
Secretary Perry, Ambassador Sondland, myself, Senator Ron Johnson was there, and also the chargé d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy at the time, Joe Pennington.
Okay. And we've talked a little bit this morning, but President Zelensky's inauguration came together rather quickly.
It did. I believe we had about 3 days' notice in which to put the delegation together.
There's been some discussion about whether the vice president was going to be able to lead that effort, and as it turned out, he was not able to lead it. Do you have any information as to why the vice president was unable to join?
I don't.
And Mr. Morrison, do you have any information as to why the vice president was unable to participate in the delegation?
No.
Ambassador Volker, you testified during your deposition that aid, in fact, does get held up from time to time for a whole assortment of reasons. Is that your understanding?
That is true.
And sometimes the holdups are rooted in something at OMB, sometimes it's at the Defense Department, sometimes it's at the State Department, sometimes it's on the Hill, correct?
That is correct.
And so when the aid was held up for 55 days for Ukraine, that didn't, in and of itself, strike you as uncommon?
No, it's something that had happened in my career in the past. I'd seen holdups of assistance. I just assumed it was part of the decision-making process. Somebody had an objection, and we had to overcome it.
Okay. And in fact, there were concerns that, perhaps President Zelensky wasn't going to be the reformer that he campaigned on?
That was a supposition that I made because of the meeting with the President on May 23rd. I thought that could be what's behind it.
And in fact, the aid was lifted shortly after he was able to convene a parliament?
I believe he, let me get the date straight. I believe, yes, he was able to convene the parliament around the 1st of September, and I believe the aid was released on the 11th of September.
And when he was able to convene a parliament, he was able to push through a number of anti-corruption initiatives?
That began with the parliament seated on that day. It was a 24-hour session, but then it continued for some time.
And that was an encouraging sign?
It started off in a very encouraging way, yes.
And other than these things going on in the background, with the pause in the aid, the U.S. relations with Ukraine, you testified, you stated it was about as good as you'd want them to be?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
You testified at your deposition that once the aid was lifted, despite all the things going on in the background, that U.S.-Ukrainian relations were strong, were as good as you want them to be.
Yes.
And you referenced that the security sector assistance was lifted, any hold on that there was a positive meeting in New York.
That's correct.
At the UNGA, and there was momentum in putting pressure on the Russians. Is that correct?
That is correct.
In your deposition, you made it clear that President Trump had a deep-rooted negative view in Ukraine and their corruption environment.
Yes.
And you first became aware of his views back in September 2017.
That is correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, in September of 2017, I was invited by Secretary Tillerson to do a pre-brief with President Trump before his meeting with President Poroshenko on the margins of the UN General Assembly. I did the pre-brief, and then I took part in the bilateral meeting.
And so long before President Zelensky was elected, President Trump had a negative view of
Yes, he had a very strongly negative view.
Back in 2017, do you remember anything he said or did that gave you a feeling that he had these negative views?
Yes. I want to be very careful here because this was a bilateral meeting between the two presidents. I don't want to stray into classified material, but I can tell you my impression was that he had a very strongly negative view of Ukraine at the time.
Okay, fair enough. And you described the president's skepticism at your deposition as a reasonable position?
Yes.
And I believe you said most people who know anything about Ukraine would possibly think that.
Yes.
And you viewed it as part of your role to help change his mind, that President Zelensky was a genuine reformer, that he was not running for office for self-enrichment, that he was indeed a good person.
That's correct.
During the May 23rd meeting with the President in the Oval Office, could you just relate to us the concerns the President articulated about Ukraine?
Yes. The President came into the meeting and immediately started speaking. He had just a string of comments that Ukraine is a terrible place, they're all corrupt, they're terrible people, they tried to take me down. I tried to explain, along with the others that were there, each of us took turns speaking. I tried to explain that President Zelensky agrees with you, that he was elected because of that situation in Ukraine, and he has a strong mandate from the people of Ukraine to change it. And that's why it's important that we actually show him very strong support now. But the President was not convinced, and he said that Zelensky is no different, that he has terrible people around him. You know, it's not what I hear about Ukraine, what we're telling him. You know, I hear that, you know, nothing has changed, talk to Rudy, that kind of dialogue as I described.
And when the President said that the Ukrainians tried to take him down, did you have any idea what he was referring to?
I did. I believe that he was referring to the rumors of efforts to interfere in the 2016 election by providing damaging information about the president or about Paul Manafort to the Hillary Clinton campaign. That was one of the rumors that had been out there and that had gotten some support from the Ukrainian prosecutor general.
And to the best of your knowledge, the President genuinely believed that, right?
I believe he was concerned about it. I don't know what he actually believed, but he brought it up.
Okay. And Mr. Morrison, you were also aware of the President's skeptical view of foreign aid generally?
Yes.
And that there was an initiative that he was looking at foreign aid pretty broadly?
Yes.
And trying to scrutinize to make sure the U.S. taxpayers were getting their money's worth?
Yes.
And the President was also interested, was he not, in better understanding opportunities for increased burden sharing among the Europeans?
Yes.
And what can you tell us about that?
The President was concerned that the United States seemed to bear the exclusive brunt of security assistance to Ukraine. He wanted to see the Europeans step up and contribute more security assistance.
And was there any interagency activity, whether it be with the State Department or the Defense Department, and coordination by the National Security Council to look into that a little bit for the President?
We were surveying the data to understand who was contributing what and sort of in what categories.
And so the President's evinced concerns, the interagency tried to address them?
Yes.
And by late August, we just discussed with Ambassador Volker that a new Rada was seated. And did that give possibly some hope that President Zelensky would be able to push through some of these reforms?
Yes.
And did you hope during this time period, during this 55 days where the aid was paused, that potentially Zelensky would be able to demonstrate his bona fides and would subsequently be able to get the president to lift the aid?
Yes.
In fact, you traveled with Ambassador Bolton to the Ukraine right around Labor Day weekend, correct?
Yes.
And you met with President Zelensky on, I believe it was August 29th?
Ambassador Bolton had a meeting with President Zelensky, and I staffed that meeting.
And that's right around the time when the Rada had met and they had started to push through their reforms?
As I recall, the date of the meeting between Ambassador Bolton and President Zelensky was actually the first day of the new Rada.
And some of these reforms included naming a new prosecutor general?
A new prosecutor general, a brand new cabinet, yes.
And they pushed through some legislation that eliminated immunity for Rada members?
Yes, eliminating a parliamentary immunity.
And I believe you provided some color into this experience, this meeting, and you said that the Ukrainians had been up all night working on some of these legislative initiatives.
Yes, the Ukrainians with whom we met were, by all appearances, exhausted from the pace of activity.
And was Ambassador Bolton encouraged by the activity?
Yes, he was.
And was the meeting altogether favorable?
Quite.
And at that point in time, after the meeting, Ambassador Bolton, did he head off to Warsaw with the Vice President, or did he just, I know you went to Warsaw.
Well, we had a few stops between Ukraine and Poland, but yes, Ambassador Bolton proceeded to Warsaw, where we were expecting to ensure everything was staged properly for the President's arrival.
And did you have an opportunity to brief the Vice President on...
I did not.
Did Ambassador Bolton?
He did.
And what do you remember from what Ambassador Bolton shared with the Vice President about the Zelensky meeting?
So I was not there. The issue I remember most starkly was Ambassador Bolton was quite annoyed that Ambassador Sondland crashed the pre-brief.
Okay.
But the ambassador had everything he needed to ensure that either the President or the Vice President were well prepared.
But did you brief Ambassador Bolton before he had an opportunity to meet with the Vice President?
I didn't need to. Ambassador Bolton was there.
Okay. But as far as you know, Ambassador Bolton communicated to the Vice President that the goings-on in Ukraine were positive?
That's my understanding.
With President Zelensky. And at this time, Ambassador Bolton was advocating for the lifting of the aid?
He had been for some time, yes.
And did you participate in the Warsaw meetings?
We had a reduced schedule from what had been arranged for the President for the Vice President. But the Vice President met with President Duda of Poland, and he met with President Zelensky, and I participated in both meetings.
And what do you remember from the meeting with President Zelensky?
It seemed very positive, very important.
What was the message? I mean, President Zelensky, he raised the issue of the aid, correct?
Yes.
And how did the Vice President respond?
He represented his support for the aid. He represented the strong commitment of the United States to Ukraine, and he explained that President Trump, because this is after the Politico article had come out that made clear there was a hold, he explained that what we were doing was the United States government, the interagency was examining what more Europe could do in the security space and taking a look at how Ukraine was reforming what has been a history of corruption.
And was there any discussion during the meeting with President Zelensky on the part of the Vice President about any of these investigations we've come to talk about?
No.
So Burisma wasn't raised?
No.
2016 election wasn't raised?
No.
And the Vice President didn't mention any investigations at all, did he?
No.
You mentioned the August 28th Politico article. Was that the first time that you believe the Ukrainians may have had a real sense that the aid was on hold?
Yes.
So from the 55-day period spanning July 18th through September 11th, it didn't really become public until August 28th?
That's correct. Ambassador Taylor and I had a number of phone calls where we, in fact, talked about, do the Ukrainians know yet? Because we both felt very strongly it was important that we ensure that the president was able to make the decision to release the aid before the Ukrainians ever found out about it.
Okay. And Ambassador Volker, is that also your recollection?
Yes, it is.
That it wasn't until the Politico article that...
That's correct. I received a text message from one of my Ukrainian counterparts on August 29th forwarding that article, and that's the first they raised it with me.
And can you share a little bit with us about your communications during that time period about the hold in the aid?
Yes. I didn't have any communications with the Ukrainians about the hold on aid until after they raised it with me for the same reason that Tim just gave, the hope that we could get it taken care of ourselves before it became something that they became aware of. Inside the U.S. government, I was aware that the hold was placed. I was aware of that on July 18th. It was referenced at an interagency meeting, and I got a readout from that meeting from one of my assistants. I then immediately spoke with several people in the administration to object. I thought that this was a bad decision or a bad hold, maybe not a decision, but a process. And I wanted to make sure that all the arguments were marshaled to get it lifted. And so I spoke with the Pentagon, with Laura Cooper. I spoke with Assistant Secretary of Parliamentary Affairs at the State Department, who is going to represent the State Department at the next higher-level meeting. I believe I spoke with officials in the European Bureau, with the National Security Council staff. So I was actively trying to convey that this needed to be lifted. And I wanted them to be able to use my name in doing so because I felt that the best prospect for positioning ourselves for negotiations with Russia is the strongest defense capability for Ukraine.
And during this time period, did you come to believe that any of these investigations were part of the holdup in the aid?
No, I did not.
Backtracking just a little bit, on July 3rd, you met in Toronto with President Zelensky, and there's been some Ambassador Taylor and Mr. Kent provided some testimony that they had some apprehension that part of this irregular channel that Ambassador Taylor referenced would rear its head in Toronto. I'm just wondering if you can tell us whether that in fact happened.
Yes, thank you. I can only tell you what I know. There may have been other conversations or other things. But I know that we had a conversation, Bill Taylor and I believe Gordon Sondland and I, around the 28th of June, that later connected to, I believe, a conversation with President Zelensky, although I may not have been part of the latter. That being said, I was convinced after that conversation we had gotten nowhere. We had our White House briefing of President Trump on May 23rd. He signed a letter inviting President Zelensky to the White House on May 29th. And for several weeks, we were just temporizing with the Ukrainians, saying, well, we're working on it. It's a scheduling issue. We'll get there. Don't worry. And I told Bill and Gordon that I was going to see President Zelensky in Toronto. And I feel an obligation to tell him the truth, that we have a problem here. We're not getting a date scheduled. Here's what I think the problem is. It's the negative information flow from Mayor Giuliani. And that he would, also that I would advise him that he should call President Trump personally, because he needed to renew that personal relationship and be able to convey to President Trump that he was serious about fighting corruption, investigating things that happened in the past, and so forth. So I did all of that with President Zelensky in a pull-aside after our formal bilateral meeting.
Okay. And during that meeting in Toronto, or the series of meetings, there was no discussion of preconditions, investigations of anything of that sort?
No.
And you were there with Mr. Kent?
Yes, I believe so.
And did you ever have any discussions with him about preconditions or investigations?
Not at that time. I think later on these things came up about when we were talking about a statement, whether there were investigations. But I believe at this time in Toronto it was really more referring to investigations generically, that is how you go about fighting corruption, and that President Zelensky should reaffirm his commitment to President Trump in a direct phone call.
Okay. And at any point in time, had Mr. Kent raised any concerns to you about any of this?
Not at that time.
Next event I want to cover is the July 10th meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office. We talked a little bit about this morning. I don't know if you caught the coverage, but there was a testimony that at some point Ambassador Sondland mentioned investigations, and reportedly the meeting ended abruptly. What can you tell us about that fact?
Thank you. Let me answer that question first. I'd like to come back to your prior question for a second, too, if I may. But on the July 10th meeting, this was a meeting that we had arranged between Alex Daniliuk, who is the head of the National Security and Defense Council, and the National Security Advisor Bolton. Attending the meeting was also Secretary Perry, Ambassador Sondland, myself, I believe Fiona Hill, and also Andrei Yermak. The purpose was really a counterpart visit. I thought that this would be the best opportunity. It was the first high-level meeting that we were having in Washington with a senior U.S. official, Ambassador Bolton, after President Zelensky's inauguration. I thought it would be a great opportunity for the Ukrainians to make their case. They are the new team in town, real deal about fighting corruption. I was rather disappointed with the meeting as it transpired. It struck me as down in the weeds, talking about reform of national security structures in Ukraine and legislation that they were working on, and not the big picture and not the bilateral relationship. So I was a bit disappointed by that. At the end of the meeting, I do recall having seen some of the other testimony. I believe Ambassador Sondland did raise the point of investigations in a generic way. This was after the meeting was already wrapping up, and I think all of us thought it was inappropriate, and the conversation did not pick up from there. The meeting was over. We all went outside, and we had a picture taken in front of the White House. And then all of us except Ambassador Bolton went down to the wardroom to talk through follow-up about how do we follow up on this meeting to keep the momentum in the relationship. And I think we broke up into several small groups. I remember having a conversation with Secretary Perry and one of his assistants about energy reform as part of that. I don't recall other conversations following up on investigations or Burisma. And to the best of your knowledge, there certainly was no precondition discussed, right? No. Again, the issue of the security assistance was one where I thought that this was really related to a general negative view about Ukraine. There was nothing specific ever communicated to me about it or the reasons why it was held, and we certainly didn't want to talk about it with the Ukrainians. We wanted to fix it.
Okay. And a couple weeks later, the July 25th call happened, and you were headed to Ukraine during that time period?
Yes, I was actually already on my way to Ukraine, I think 2 days prior to that.
And you received readouts both from the U.S. side and the Ukrainian side. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. So I was not on the phone call. I had arrived in Ukraine, and I had had that lunch with Mr. Yermak that we saw on the day of the phone call. I had been pushing for the phone call because I thought it was important to renew the personal connection between the two leaders and to congratulate President Zelensky on the parliamentary election. The readout that I received from Mr. Yermak and then also from the U.S. side, although I'm not exactly sure who it was from on the U.S. side, but there was a U.S. and a Ukrainian readout, were largely the same, that it was a good call. It was a congratulatory phone call for the president's win in the parliamentary election. President Zelensky did reiterate his commitment to reform and fighting corruption in Ukraine, and President Trump did reiterate his invitation to President Zelensky to come visit him in the White House. It's exactly what I thought the phone call would be, so I was not surprised at getting that as the readout.
And did you ever have any discussions with Ambassador Taylor about this?
At that time, we were together in Ukraine at that time. We went the very next day to visit the conflict zone, and I'm sure he heard the same readout that I did.
And you had a meeting with President Zelensky on the 26th?
Yes, we had a meeting the day after the phone call on the 26th in the morning before heading out to the conflict
And
zone.
were any of these concerning elements that some witnesses have raised about the call raised in the meeting with President Zelensky?
No, only the very bare bones readout that I had received. That was also how it was discussed in the meeting with President Zelensky.
So to the extent there's been assertions that President Zelensky was concerned about demands President Trump had made?
I don't recall that.
You don't recall that?
I do not recall being...
or-
I don't recall... Well, let me turn that around and say he was very positive about the phone call.
Okay.
I don't recall him saying anything about demands, but he was very upbeat about the fact of the call.
And there was no discussion on the part of President Zelensky on how to navigate the various
I don't recall that.
concerns that people have articulated about the call?
I don't remember that.
And Mr. Zeldin asked you in the deposition that in no way, shape, or form, in either readouts from the United States or Ukraine, did you receive any indication whatsoever for anything that resembled a quid pro quo. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the same would go for this new allegation of bribery?
I've only seen an allegation of bribery in the last week.
It's the same common set of facts. It's just instead of quid pro quo, now it's bribery.
I was never involved in anything that I considered to be bribery at all.
Okay, or extortion?
Or extortion.
Okay.
Mr. Castor, may I address two specific points?
Of course.
One is I'm reminded that the meeting with Ambassador Bolton and Mr. Daniliuk took place on July 10th.
Yes.
And I did not become aware of the hold on security assistance until July 18th.
Right. Okay.
So that is another reason why that did not come up.
Okay. And at that point in time, you didn't know that the potential pause in the security assistance was brewing?
I did not. No, I heard about it for the first time on the 18th of July. May I make a second observation as well?
Absolutely.
I do remember having seen some of the testimony of Mr. Kent, a conversation in which he had asked me about the conspiracy theories that were out there in Ukraine. I don't remember what the date of this conversation was. And my view was, well, if there are things like that, then why not investigate them? I don't believe that there's anything to them. If there is, 2016 election interference is what I was thinking of. We would want to know about that, but I didn't really believe there's anything there to begin with.
You testified in your deposition to the extent the Ukrainians were going to investigate other Ukrainians for wrongdoing, that was perfectly appropriate in your mind?
Correct. That has been U.S. policy for years.
So if certain Ukrainians involved with the Burisma company,
that I think is the only plausible thing to look at there. As I said, I don't find it plausible or credible that Vice President Biden would have been influenced in his duties, but whether individual Ukrainians in the society that we know Ukraine has been for decades were trying to act in a corrupt way or to buy influence, that's plausible.
Right. Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent last Wednesday told us about there was an investigation into Burisma trying to recoup millions of taxpayer dollars, and the Ukrainians were pursuing an investigation. There was a bribe paid. Were you tracking that?
I was aware of those kinds of things. I couldn't give you those kinds of details. I just know that there was a reputation around the company.
Okay. And subsequent to those facts and the bribe being paid, the Burisma company wanted to improve their image and added some folks to their board, including the President of Poland, including Hunter Biden. Are you familiar with that?
That's what I understand.
And to the extent the Ukrainians, the folks affiliated with Burisma, wanted to hire those people for their board for protection purposes so they could continue to engage in misdeeds, if that was a fact worth investigating, you certainly would be supportive of Ukrainians trying to get to the bottom of that, correct?
Well, I can't speculate as to any of the specifics of what was motivating Burisma or not. Ukrainian government authorities investigating possible corruption by Ukrainian citizens is a perfectly appropriate thing for them to do.
Mr. Morrison, I want to turn our attention back to the July 25th call. You were in the room. Did anything concern you on the call?
No.
And after the call ended, you, like Colonel Vindman, one of your next steps was to engage the NSC lawyers. And your reasons for doing that were slightly different than Colonel Vindman's. And you articulated three concerns. And do you want to share them with us, or would you rather I do it?
So I think I articulated two concerns. If I'm forgetting one, please remind me. But the two concerns I had were, one, I did not see representatives of NSC Legal on the call. And so I wanted to make sure that the legal advisor and his deputy were aware of the call. And I was also concerned about taking steps to protect the MEMCON, limit its disclosure for fear of the consequences of it leaking.
And you were concerned about it leaking because you were worried about how it would play out in Washington's polarized political environment, correct?
Yes.
And you were also worried how that would lead to the bipartisan support here in Congress towards Ukraine, right?
Yes.
And you were also concerned that it might affect the Ukrainians' perception negatively.
Yes.
And in fact, all three of those things have played out, haven't they?
Yes.
You didn't ask the lawyers to put it on the code word system, correct?
Oh, I want to be precise about the lexicon here. I did not ask for it to be moved to a compartmented system.
Okay. You just wanted the transcript to be controlled.
I wanted access to be restricted.
Okay. And when you learned that the transcript had been stored on the compartmented server, you believe that was a mistake, correct?
Well, it was represented to me that it was a mistake. I was trying to pull up that MEMCON because we were in the process of pulling together Ambassador Bolton's materials and the President's materials for what was a planned bilat between POTUS and President Zelensky. And when I went to do that, I could not pull up the package in our system, and I did not understand why. I spoke with the NSC Executive Secretariat staff, asked them why, and they did their research, and they informed me it had been moved to the higher classification system at the direction of John Eisenberg, whom I then asked why. I mean, if that was the judgment he made, that's not necessarily mine to question, but I didn't understand it. And he essentially told me I gave no such direction. He did his own inquiry, and he represented back to me that it was, his understanding was that it was a kind of administrative error, that when he also gave direction to restrict access, the Executive Secretariat staff understood that as an apprehension that there was something in the content of the MEMCON that could not exist on the lower classification system.
So to the best of your knowledge, there's no malicious intent in moving the transcript to the compartmented server?
Correct.
And to your knowledge, anybody on the NSC staff that needed access to the transcript for their official duties always was able to access it, correct? People that had a need to know and a need to access it?
Once it was moved to the compartmented system?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. The MEMCON of the July 25th call was, in your experience, prepared normally?
Yes.
That there isn't an exact transcription of what's said on the call, correct?
Correct.
That there's note takers in the situation room, and then they prepare a draft and it's circulated among relevant parties?
Essentially, yes.
And you had responsibility for coordinating any edits?
Yes, we look at the shorthand, we'll call it a transcript, but the memorandum of conversation, and we ensure that transcription is as close to accurate as possible given our requirements under the Presidential Records Act.
Okay. And, Colonel Vindman testified that he thought it was very accurate. Did you as well?
I viewed it as complete and accurate.
Okay. Colonel Vindman did articulate that he had a couple edits. He wanted Burisma inserted, I think it was on page 3 or 4, in place of the company in one of the sections where President Zelensky was talking. Are you aware of that edit request?
I understand that he said in either this proceeding or the deposition that he wanted that request, yes.
Okay. At the time, did you understand that he had asked for that?
I don't recall that. It was my practice, if I believed an edit accurately represented the call, I would accept it. If I didn't hear it in the call, if it didn't exist in my notes, I wouldn't have made the edit.
Okay. Yeah, he just, on page 4, he wanted to swap out the word company for Burisma. And when that edit from Colonel Vindman was not installed, did he give you any negative feedback that it was crucial that that edit get in the document?
Not that I can recall.
Okay. Did he ever raise any concerns to you about the accuracy of the transcript?
Not that I can recall.
Did he ever raise any concerns to you generally about the call?
When we were discussing the track changes version of the MEMCON, I believe he had some concerns about the call. I believe we both agreed we wanted that more full-throated embrace of President Zelensky and his reform agenda, and we didn't get it.
Okay. You indicated in your deposition that when you took over the portfolio for Dr. Hill, July 15th, you were alerted to potential issues in Colonel Vindman's judgment?
Yes.
Did she relay anything specifically to you? Why she thought that?
Not as such. It was more of a overarching statement from her and her deputy, who became my deputy, that they had concerns about judgment.
Okay. Did any other NSC personnel raise concerns with you about Mr. Vindman?
Yes.
Or, I'm sorry, Colonel Vindman. And what were some of those concerns that were brought to your attention?
There were...
I'm sorry, we are not going to... I'm going to instruct him not to answer. I'm going to instruct him not to answer because I think that it's beyond the scope of what you're asking for. These concerns, Mr. Castor, predated any involvement with Ukrainian sector assistance.
Well, during the deposition, I asked you, Mr. Morrison, whether others raised a concern that Colonel Vindman may have leaked information.
You did ask that, yes.
Yeah, and your answer was?
Others had represented that, yes.
Okay. And I asked you whether you were concerned Colonel Vindman did not keep you in the loop at all times with his official duties?
Yes.
And in fact, when he went to the National Security Council lawyers following the July 25th call, he did not first come to you. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you were his supervisor in the chain of command, correct?
Correct.
And in hindsight, did you wish that he had come to you first before going to the lawyers?
Yes.
And why is that?
One, if he had concerns about something, about the content of the call, that's something I would have expected to have been notified of. I also think, just as a matter of practice, since we both went to the lawyers, we didn't necessarily both need to, and economy of effort may have prevailed.
Okay. At any point subsequently, did he become frustrated that he felt cut out of some of the Ukraine portfolio?
Yes.
And what was the nature of his concerns?
Well, I think the easiest way to say it is he was concerned with respect to, for example, the Ukraine trip, that he did not go. He asked me why it is my practice to have a number of the conversations with Ambassador Taylor one-on-one, and there were certain other matters.
Okay. And did you ever get the sense that you resolved his concerns, or did they linger?
I explained to him my thinking, and that was that.
Okay. Before my time expires, Ambassador Volker, I want to turn quickly to the what Ambassador Taylor describes as the irregular channel. He was a participant with you and Ambassador Sondland, hundreds of text messages, correct?
Correct.
And so, did he ever raise concerns about what was going on during the time period of the early August time period?
Only as you saw reflected in the text messages themselves, where he said, is this now a linkage, or are we doing this? He had a concern about, just in general, Rudy Giuliani, which I think a lot of us had, but the issue is, what do you do about it, about the role that he's playing? And as you note, we were in frequent contact, near daily contact throughout this entire period.
And so, did he ever engage you in a one-on-one telephone call to articulate his concerns?
No, we were on many one-on-one telephone calls. He did not raise those concerns that way, no.
Okay. And this, I mean, you're a experienced diplomat. At one point in time, Senate confirmed. Ambassador Sondland is the ambassador to the European Union. Secretary Perry is the Secretary of Energy. Certainly not... it doesn't sound like an irregular bunch. Did he ever articulate to you that he thought the three of you working on Ukraine policy was a problem?
No, he did not.
And were you surprised during his testimony when he came in for the deposition, when he sort of established these two tracks, that one was a regular channel that he was in charge of and the other was a
Yes,
irregular
I don't agree with his characterization of that, because I had been in my role for a couple of years. I had been the lead on U.S.-Ukraine negotiations and negotiating with Russia and the interagency work and the work with our allies. And we have a Secretary of Energy who is a cabinet official. And I think having support from various U.S. officials for our strengthening our engagement with Ukraine, I view it as a very positive thing. And if the concern is not us so much then, because we're all U.S. officials, but Mayor Giuliani, I don't view that as a channel at all, because he's not a representative of the U.S. government. He's a private citizen. I viewed him as perhaps a useful barometer in understanding what may be helpful communication from the Ukrainian government, but not someone in a position to represent the U.S. government at all.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, why don't we take a 5 or 10 minute break? If I could ask the audience to allow the witnesses to leave the room first. We are in recess.
All right, so we are watching as they take a break in this hearing. It's been a very long day. Some of the most interesting testimony has come from the two people who are sitting there now, particularly when it comes to asking questions about a phone call that the president was on with the president of Ukraine, the thing that tipped us as a nation into impeachment investigations. And so I'm Harris Faulkner, Fox News headquarters in New York. You're watching our live coverage continue today. We've been going since 9 a.m. Eastern. We started off with two witnesses, and then the last two. What's so different right now is that these are the first two people that we've heard from that Republicans wanted to hear from, because their push against the process has been pretty strong from the beginning of all of this. When would they get a shot to ask questions of their own witnesses? And they're getting it now. I want to bring in my power panel now. Justin Safey, a Republican strategist and a former top advisor to former Governor Jeb Bush. Doug Schoen to my left, a Fox News contributor, and most importantly on this evening, advisor to Bill Clinton during the impeachment. I'm going to start with you, Doug, because you had some interesting takes on all of this, not the least of which is this is not working for Democrats. Why do you say that?
Well, what failed for the Republicans in the late 90s, and I dare say is not succeeding here for the Democrats, is making a credible case about the phone call and a quid pro quo, or about bribery. The evidence is murky at best, and to get bipartisan support, which we had in the Nixon impeachment, you had the so-called smoking gun tape and a clear acknowledgement by people like John Dean of wrongdoing. We have none of that here.
Justin, I want to bring you in. The Republicans have Ambassador Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine, and Tim Morrison, White House aide for the NSC for Europe and Russia. And what we've seen is a back and forth about that call on July 25th. Did the President of the United States use leverage against the President of Ukraine, saying, we're going to withhold cash for weapons while you go investigate my political rival, Joe Biden? What do you think of their strategy at this point?
Well, what's remarkable to me is none of the two witnesses that we just saw disputed the accuracy of that transcript. So there's no quid pro quo in that transcript of the call that President Trump had with the President of Ukraine. And I think that's still a very compelling. None of the four witnesses we heard from today destroyed the legitimacy of that transcript. And I think that's what you're going to see the White House and the President continue to hang their hat on, is where's the evidence of any wrongdoing based on that transcript. None of the four witnesses today challenged it.
Now, there was one moment, and it happened just a couple of minutes ago. I'm going to ask my team if we are ready to go to roll that little clip of video. It was very short. The Republican attorney, on behalf of the House Intelligence Committee ranking member, that's ahead of the Republicans there in that committee, Devin Nunes, the lawyer for the group of the GOP and that ranking member asked the question, was there anything that you saw that was concerning about that July 25th call of both the witnesses? Watch.
I want to turn our attention back to the July 25th call. You were in the room. Did anything concern you on the call?
No.
Doug Schoen, you look up at the ceiling,
right,
and you have a one-word answer. What does that do to the Democrats' case?
It makes it much more difficult to advance in the bipartisan way I was discussing, because when you have the lead official inside the White House on Ukraine saying there was nothing wrong, how then do you make a case that there was clearly a prima facie evidence of wrongdoing?
And Justin, do Democrats have to come up with some there, or can they push forward with the President did something untoward on a phone call, and that is enough to impeach him?
Look, I think that for the Democrats, for them, many of them, it's a foregone conclusion. This is just a show. It's a big show. They're trying to hog up the airwaves.
Yeah, but they've got to convince the American people, because the American people are going to vote in less than a year.
They do, and they're giving it their best shot. They're trying to create smoke. There's no fire, and I think it's just a lot of smoke and mirrors. But I think that this foreign policy debate that was taking place within the White House, it's very dense. It's very hard for most Americans to understand that. And that's why I think it's still very effective to focus on that transcript and to look at the transcript and see that the President didn't do anything wrong.
All right, let's lean in a little bit about what you're talking about. And by the way, in the center of your screen, you see the attorney for the Republicans off to the left. In the center, in that light blue shirt, is Representative Jim Jordan. And he was brought over from another committee because he's a tough questioner, and he has been kind of, if you will, the heat behind some of the proceedings leading up to impeachment inquiry, really pushing for Republicans to get their say here, to get their witnesses through. Doug, as I come to you, I want to share something that Bill Clinton, your former boss, said. He called in recently to a competitor on another issue, and ended up being asked, well, what do you make of the situation with impeachment? And he said, look, my message was, back when he was being impeached, look, you've been hired to do a job. You don't get to every day an opportunity to make something good happen. And I would say I've got lawyers and staff people handling this impeachment inquiry, and they should just handle it. Have at it. Meanwhile, I'm going to work for the American people. That's what I would do. Almost tacitly giving some advice there to President Trump.
It's not only what he recommended Trump do as president, but it's what he did and we did in 1998. It was progress over politics. We had an ironclad rule that the political team and the messaging team would not talk about impeachment. We talked only about things like the economy, economic growth, Social Security, the environment. And by doing that, we kept the president's approval rating over 60% and insulated him from the allegations about impeachment to the extent possible.
Leadership among the Republicans right now, you see just wrapping up his cell phone there to the right is Congressman Mark Meadows. I'm just kind of calling out some of the players in all of this. I'm wondering, Justin, you know, you see people on their phones. And by the way, Bill Clinton wasn't able to tweet back then, so I wonder how it might have changed things, right? But what do you think is going on behind the scenes right now based on the kind of day you think that the GOP has had?
Well, look, I think that the GOP has the Republican members of that committee, for those service members, those longtime career officials, they have a very delicate balance that they have to walk. They have to try to question some of their conclusions that they're reaching, but not do so that calls into question their patriotism or anything like that. But look, if I'm one of the Republican members of that committee, I feel pretty good because I think that none of the witnesses today were really able to have that aha moment, that smoking gun moment that Doug referred to earlier that you had in the Watergate impeachment. I think if you're the Democrats, you have to be disappointed that they haven't had that aha moment. And I think going back to what Bill Clinton's advice was, I think this is the biggest risk for the Democrats, is that the American people are going to see the Democratic Congress in the House so focused on inside Washington politics and this with the impeachment hearing, and they don't see them focusing on things like jobs and things like health care and prescription drugs and trade issues and immigration issues, the issues that most of the people are watching this debate today, they're working, trying to put food on their table for their families, and they see this game that the Democrats are playing, and it turns them off.
So, Doug, I want to talk about this just in terms of the messaging for the American people, because, you know, President Trump is out there on the bandstands, doing rallies, and doing some of what Justin is saying, talking about what real people care about. Well, Democrats can do some of that, too. I mean, you've got, what, 20 of them running for president? I may not be exact on the number because there are two that are about to get in now, apparently. One just did, and we're waiting to see what Michael Bloomberg's going to do. But my point in all of that is you also have an opportunity and a mouthpiece among Democrats. But it's kind of split up because there's so many of them.
Here's the problem that the Democrats face, the candidates and indeed the party. We have lost any messaging on issues that have worked for the Democrats, like climate change, like guns, like health care. Those are Democratic issues. They worked in 2018. But I dare say, Harris, all we've been hearing about lately is impeachment. And while all Democrats, virtually all Democrats, support it, no Republicans do, and independents are split. So this works against the party building a positive message.
Let me ask you a quick question. We've got Kevin Corke outside the White House, so I want to get to him. But, you know, people are always telling me within your political party, Doug, that there are so many more moderates than there are those progressives, right? Like the squad members, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who put out the Green New Deal plan. But is that the truth, or are they running the party now?
Here's what's happened. The energy, the enthusiasm is with the progressive wing and people like the squad. So moderates do exist. They're not by any means extinct, but they don't have the leadership, the energy, and the control of the dialogue.
So can a Warren or a Bernie Sanders can Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders get elected?
I don't think they can get elected, but Trump can lose the election.
How so?
Because Trump can make enough mistakes, unforced errors, to elect an alternative. But where Warren is now, where Sanders is now, I don't think they would match up particularly well with the president.
All right, Justin Safey, stand by, and Doug Schoen, stand by. Kevin Corke, live outside the White House. And Kevin, I understand you have new reaction coming from the White House tonight. We did hear from the president as he was hosting his 23rd cabinet member meeting today, and he had a little blurb about impeachment. What's the latest?
Yeah, you're right about that. By the way, that was the last cabinet meeting, presumptively anyway, for the outgoing Energy Secretary, Rick Perry. Now, earlier, Harris, you may recall that we talked about Stephanie Grisham and her statement about the morning session. She called the process illegitimate, for example, adding that the president had done nothing criminal, had done nothing to do with bribery, and that there was nothing nefarious about the now infamous call back on July 25th. We have new reaction I want to share with the folks that are listening to you right now. This from the National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General Kellogg. He is a National Security Advisor to the Vice President Mike Pence, and his statement details, again, that July 25th call. Let me share what he has just given us here at Fox News not terribly long ago. It says this: I was on the much-reported July 25th call between President Donald Trump and President Zelensky. I heard nothing wrong or improper on the call. I had and have no concerns. Ms. Williams, he's speaking there of Jennifer Williams, was also on the call. And as she testified, she never reported any personal or professional concerns to me, her direct supervisor, regarding the call. In fact, she never reported any personal or professional concerns to any other member of the Vice President's staff. So what they're doing here, Harris, is, again, they're trying to point this out. If there was anything wrong, not everyone agreed that there was something wrong. Obviously, their perspective is there was nothing wrong with the call. You can read the transcript and make a determination for yourself. They're trying to contrast that with the messaging that you may have heard today from Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. Harris?
Yeah, so I'm looking, and I'm seeing that the mention of Jennifer Williams, who was among those first two to testify in this hearing today, I'm wondering why put this out specific on her. Was there something specifically about her testimony?
I think, again, it's that contrast. For example, when people play this back, and you're going to see Vindman everywhere tonight, and make his strong statement against what he believed was an improper request